Lesson 23, the present subjunctive of conjugation 1 and sum, the subjunctive of purpose. Hi everyone, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we are on lesson 23, and that's on page 67. Today we have an interesting new verb thing to talk about, and that is called the subjunctive mood. As you know so far from your Latin studies, Latin verbs are divided into certain groups called conjugations. We have the first conjugation, the second conjugation, the third conjugation, and the fourth conjugation. That's how we talk about them. That's the terminology. Also in the third conjugation, there's a little extra group called third conjugation IO verbs, and they have a special characteristic. But basically, we have four conjugations. By the way, ancient Roman grammarians often looked at it as just three conjugations. They didn't really look at the grammar the same way we do today. They also looked at adjectives really as substantive words, basically like nouns. If you want to learn more about that, you can read a Roman grammarian named Donatus, that's D-O-N-A-T-U-S. But anyway, we have four conjugations, but that's not the only way we talk about verbs. Those aren't the only classifications that we can put verbs into. We also have tenses. We have, the timing of a verb. Does a verb talk about action that happened in the past, in the present, in the future? Or in the pluperfect, that's the past of the past. It's like two pasts ago. In English, we use the word had for that, as in, I had gone to the store before going to the coffee shop or something like that. We also have person, which is like a first person, second person, third person. We have number, singular and plural. So we have lots of different ways to talk about verbs and the different qualities they have, the different things they communicate, the different meanings they can convey. And so today we're going to talk about yet another kind of verb or another classification type for verbs. And that's what we call mood, M-O-O-D. Okay, so a verb can have tense, number, person. It can have voice, as in active and passive. Okay, but it can also have a quality called mood. Okay, and there are several moods to know about. We don't mean moods like happy or sad. What we mean is a characteristic by which the verb can have different shades of meaning. Okay, and so we have several moods in Latin. We have the indicative mood, we have the subjunctive mood, and we have the imperative mood. I think also some people refer to the infinitive as a mood, although I don't think that's everyone who thinks that. But the imperative is definitely a mood. What is the imperative? The imperative is when you give someone a command. If you say to someone, go home, okay, you're issuing a command to that person, and so we call that the imperative mood. The indicative mood is the kind of mood that we use simply to convey information, to state, or as the name suggests, indicate information or activity. So if I say, he is going home, that's a simple indicative sentence. In Latin, that verb, doing that kind of thing, we would say it's in the indicative mood. You might say that the purpose of the indicative mood is to convey real action or to describe real action or real activity that is occurring or has occurred. So the new thing we're learning about today, the subjunctive mood, is a kind of verb that you can use to talk about action that is not real, okay? It's action that is not actually happening, but instead it's action that takes place only in the mind or in the intentions or in the wishes or in the hopes, okay? So it's not real action or activity that's actually taking place. The subjunctive mood communicates the idea of action that is hoped for, wished for, action that's possible, action that could happen or may happen. So that's the big difference that we want to talk about today. So let's review here quickly. The indicative mood, the whole purpose of the indicative mood is to convey real action, to talk about actual activity or action that's happening or has happened or will happen. The imperative mood, well, that's to give a command. And then the subjunctive mood is to talk about activity that is hoped for, wished for, possible, may happen, okay? Action that's not real, like the indicative does. So that's the big idea here with the subjunctive mood. And as we go along here, we'll look at different ways in Latin that you can arrange a phrase to use the subjunctive to communicate something, okay? We have the subjunctive in English too. We use it all the time. Let me give you a few examples. If I go to a friend's birthday party and the person has his cake in front of him and we all sing happy birthday, I might say to that person, may you have many more birthdays. Okay, if I say, may you have many more birthdays, the action that I'm talking about there is action that is wished for. I'm not saying that you definitely will have many more birthdays. I'm saying that I hope you have many more birthdays. And so in English, we say the word may. So if I say, may you, blah, 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 that is action that's hoped for or wished for. Okay, so that's an example of the subjunctive mood in English. Same thing in Latin. If you make a statement like that, you'll use the subjunctive. If you're at a church and the pastor or priest says to the congregation, may God bless you. Okay, that pastor or priest is using the subjunctive. He's not saying, God will definitely bless you. He's expressing a wish. He's saying, basically, I hope that God blesses you, or, we want for God to bless you. He's expressing a wish or a hope. Again, that's the subjunctive, and if you said something like that in Latin, you would use the subjunctive mood. If I'm hosting a party at my house, and we're all standing in the kitchen, but the food is all in the dining room, I might say to the crowd, I might say, let us all now proceed into the dining room. So when I make a statement like that, it's a polite way to suggest to everyone that they do something. It's not the same as the imperative. If I wanted to use the imperative, I would say, go into the dining room. With the imperative mood, you're issuing a direct command. You're just telling someone to do something. But you can make it sound more polite if you use the subjunctive. You can say, let us now go into the dining room. So when you say that, you're not saying something in the indicative. You're not saying, we are now going into the dining room, or we will go into the dining room. You're not saying that. You're suggesting it as a polite way to encourage everyone to do that. And so it's not real action. It's action that is hoped for, wished for, suggested. And so therefore, that's the subjunctive mood. And in Latin, if you said that kind of thing, you would use the subjunctive mood to do that. Here's another way to use the subjunctive. If I'm sitting there reminiscing about the past, and I say to myself, if only I could go back and do it all over again. Okay? the idea of going back and doing it all over again, that's not real action. I'm not actually going back and doing things over again. I'm simply, fantasizing about it or, wishing I could do it. So again, that's the subjunctive mood. And if I were to say something like that in Latin, I would use the subjunctive mood to do it. Another really common use of the subjunctive is in conditional statements. Statements that involve the word if, okay? If I have a friend who lives in a different city and the friend invites me over, I might say to that friend, okay, well, if I make it over to your city, I might stop by. Or if I make it to your city one day, I'll stop by. So that's not real action that's definitely occurring. It's action that's conditional. It's predicated upon some event happening. It's going to happen perhaps on the condition that I visit that person's city. So in Latin, if you said something like that, you would use the subjunctive mood to do that. And in fact, in Latin, learning about how conditions work can actually be kind of complicated. So another kind of condition you might see is this kind of thing. If I say to someone, if you had studied harder in school, you would have made better grades. So when you say that to someone, you're not saying that they actually did study harder in school. The whole thing is starting out with the word if. You're saying if you had studied harder in school. The activity of studying harder in school is not actual, real activity. It's just part of this condition that you're saying. You're saying if that had happened, okay? So the action is not real action. It's action that's woven into this conditional statement that you're making. And so if you said something like that in Latin, you would use the subjunctive mood to do it. So I've given you a few examples here of ways to use the subjunctive. What all these ways have in common is that they're not real, actual action. They're statements of action that's hoped for, wished for, possible, action that is suggested, action that's part of a condition and it's predicated upon some kind of condition being met. Okay, so these are all ways you can use the subjunctive mood, both in English and in Latin. It's really the same in both. Because again, we have the subjunctive in English. So with all that having been said, a little ablative absolute there, let's go to section 195 and let's look at what the book is going to tell us. It says here, formation of the present subjunctive. Okay, so now they're going to tell us how to actually make the subjunctive, how to actually make the different forms of subjunctive verbs. Okay, it says the subjunctive mood has 4 tenses: the present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect. Okay, so in Latin, the indicative has more tenses than the subjunctive does. Now, why is that? The way it's been explained to me is as follows. For indicative verbs that are in the indicative mood, we have future, we have present, we have perfect, imperfect, pluperfect, and future perfect, okay? The way it's been explained to me is that the future tense is, in and of itself, somewhat unreal. Why is it unreal? Because you can't really truly predict the future. If I say the statement, I will go to the coffee shop today, okay? Technically, that's the indicative mood. There's nothing subjunctive about it. It's stating action that is real in a sense, but it's action that is not real in the sense that it's predictive. I'm really predicting the future when I make a future statement like that. If I say, I will go to the coffee shop today, there's no guarantee that I'll actually go. I may be planning to go or intending to go, but still, the action is not really real until I actually do it. It's more in my mind. It's a plan or an idea. And so, in that way, the future tense involves uncertainty. There's a certain quality of uncertainty inherent in the future tense because it hasn't happened yet. And so, in the subjunctive mood, we also have that same feeling of uncertainty because it's not real action. So, in this manner, the subjunctive and the future both share a certain quality of uncertainty. That's something that they have in common. And so that's why it's been explained to me that we don't have future subjunctives because the subjunctive already has a quality of uncertainty built into it. So anyway, when you look at this list here of the subjunctive tenses, you have present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect. What you don't have there is future. So the basic idea here is that you have more tenses for indicative verbs than for subjunctive verbs, okay? Because of that uncertainty thing that I mentioned a moment ago. You know, if you want to make a subjunctive verb future, you know, you don't really need to do that because the future is already uncertain. It's already not real. So that's the issue there with why there's no future subjunctive. Moving back to the present, we're talking here in this lesson about how to actually form the different forms of the subjunctive in the first conjugation in the present tense. So here in section 196, we have a chart that's going to help us see how to actually form the different forms of the subjunctive. And again, this is first conjugation. So we have our model verb, which is laudo. I think the authors of this book always use laudo as sort of a sample verb. And so here we see it again. The verb laudo, which means praise. And to make a long story short, here in the first conjugation, what we're going to do is take the vowel, the connector vowel, which is the letter A, and we turn that into an E, okay? So in the first person plural, instead of laudamus with a long A, instead you get a long E and you get laudamus. Second person plural, instead of laudatus, you get laudatus. In the second person singular, instead of laudas, you get laudes. Okay? So again, basic story here is you're changing A to E. Laudet in the third person singular, laudent, third person plural. In the first person singular, you get a little bit of a different thing going on. You get the letter M as your ending, okay? So instead of laudo, you get laudem. In the present tense passive, you get the same passive endings you already know, but with a different connector vowel. You get, again, that E instead of the A. So in the first person plural, instead of laudamur, you get laudamur. Third person plural, instead of laudantur, you get laudintur. In the first person singular here, you have lauder, L-A-U-D-E-R, instead of, if it were indicative, passive, it would be laudor, L-A-U-D-O-R. Okay, so you're learning different flavors of verbs here. You could have a verb that's indicative and active, indicative and passive, subjunctive and active, or subjunctive and passive, okay? So when you're reading Latin, you have to pay attention to the endings, and you have to pay attention to the connector vowels, the little vowel that comes between the stem and the personal ending, okay? Each little part of a Latin verb conveys something. It means something. So you have to pay attention, and you can't snooze. For those of you who really want to study this stuff and really absorb it, you might consider copying out these paradigms. And when I say paradigm, what I mean is these little charts that show the different forms. When I study Greek, I spend a lot of time copying out verb paradigms, and it really helps me to memorize the different forms of various Greek verbs. I just get a a stack of scratch paper and a pen that I can easily write with, a nice smooth pen, and I just copy them out by hand over and over. And if you do that a little each day, it really starts to get the different verb forms, sort of branded into your brain. And trust me, when I'm studying Greek, I need all the help I can get. So copying things out can be an effective way to learn, copying things out by hand. So for those of you who are struggling with the different forms of verbs or nouns, by the way, the forms, we call that morphology. When you study the different forms of a noun or verb, we say you're studying the morphology of the nouns or verbs. So I recommend copying things out by hand as a good memorization technique. And as I've said many times, another great way to do this is to actually say these words, to speak them as much as you possibly can. A lot of people, when they study Latin, they only want to read Latin. They just want to read. But there are more ways to use language than only reading. And so why is it that people who do Latin want to just read it all the time? Well, they have a pretty good reason for that. The reason is that Latin isn't spoken anymore. And what we have is lots and lots of texts. So when people do Latin, especially at more advanced levels, what they want to do is they want to read texts and learn about history, poetry, and philosophy. And so oftentimes, the main thing you end up doing with Latin is just reading texts. And that's great. Let's all read texts. That's fabulous. But for students who are learning this stuff for the first time, reading is only one of several ways to use language. As far as I can tell, there are 4 ways to experience language: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. So reading and listening are input. Writing and speaking are output. Okay, so you have 2 inputs and 2 outputs. Reading and writing take place in a recorded written format. Listening and speaking take place in an audio or sound format. Okay, but add it all up, you have 4 ways to experience language. So if you only read Latin, you're experiencing Latin in only one of 4 possible ways. So if you're reading Latin, that's fine. But think of the possibilities. You could also write it out. You could write things in Latin. You could listen to someone speaking Latin. You could say things in Latin yourself. Okay? So there are different possibilities that I want to open up your mind to. If you're an advanced Latinist and you've been doing Latin for 30 years, you probably get the idea and you may not need much help to do Latin. But if you're new to this and you're a student, these other ways of experiencing the language can really help you learn faster and better. So, therefore, my advice to you would be, don't be a reading-only kind of Latin person, someone who only reads it. Try to experience the Latin language in all 4 ways. Say it, hear it, read it, and write it. And if you experience it in all those different ways, you're just going to be more immersed in the language, and you're just simply going to learn it faster and better. As far as our current purposes go, that is learning about the subjunctive, again, what you can do is copy out the paradigms. What I do is I copy it out, and then I compare what I wrote to the example that I'm working from. For example, something in a textbook, and I take notice of any mistakes I made. Sometimes I just copy it straight from the paradigm, just without any effort to write it from memory. But after I do it a few times, then I try to do it from memory. And then I have to stop and think, gosh, what's coming next here? What do I write? Then I have to look back at the paradigm and see, oh yeah, that's that letter. And it can be a bit tedious, but it really pays big dividends because it helps you learn. So when you copy out paradigms, you can simply copy it straight from the from the chart without any attempt to memorize, or you can try to do it from memory. You can cover up the chart, write it out from memory, and then do error detection. See what mistakes you made, correct the errors, and then try it all again. So if you do this for, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day, you can really make lots of headway, especially if you're a new student, if you're someone who's new to the language. Okay, so that's me giving you some learning advice. Let's get back to the lesson here at the top of page 68. Now we're going to learn how to say the verb of being in the subjunctive mood. Okay, if you want to say I am, you would say sum, S-U-M. To make it subjunctive, you change the U to an I and you get sim. Okay? And so for these present tense forms of sum, you have the letter I before the personal ending. Okay, so sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. Technically, the I is long there in the first person plural. So I suppose you could say simus if you wanted to. In the second person singular, you could say sis. Second person plural, you could say situs. Another thing people do to memorize these groups of verbs is to chant them. So they might say sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. Okay? When we chant them fast like that, it's hard to get those long vowels. So instead of saying sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint, when we just say them quickly, the vowel becomes short. But technically, those are long vowels there, so you should pay attention to that. Okay, let's move on now to section 197, and it says uses of the subjunctive. And I've already covered a lot of this at the beginning, but it won't hurt to review it. The authors of the book here want to tell us their view of how the subjunctive can be used in Latin. And they give us a few examples. Laudamus, okay, that's first person plural, subjunctive. Notice the long E there before the personal ending. And so if that were indicative, it would be we praise, but it's not indicative, it's subjunctive. So the idea is let us praise. Okay, in grammatical terms, that's what we call the hortatory subjunctive. Okay, what does it mean if something is hortatory? Okay, the word hortatory comes from a Latin verb that is the word hortor, and hortor means to encourage. Okay, so if something is hortatory, it means you're encouraging someone to do something. Other English words with that same root would be words like exhort. If I exhort my friend to do a certain thing, I'm strongly encouraging him to do a thing, okay? And in a noun form, we have the word exhortation. If I say, I issued a strong exhortation to my comrades, it means I gave them a strong encouragement or a strong suggestion that they do something. So that H-O-R-T root word, that comes from the Latin verb hortor, which means to encourage. And so that's why we have the word hortatory. If you say laudamus, let us praise, that's a hortatory subjunctive because you're encouraging people to do an activity. You're not using the imperative. You're not saying, hey, all you people over there, praise. You're not saying that. You're encouraging them in a polite way. Let us praise. And so when you see the hortatory subjunctive, you typically see it in the first person plural with a let us do something, okay? Remember that when you're first person plural, the speaker is included in that group. If you say we are doing something, well, the speaker is speaking for himself or herself plus other people. So in Latin, when you see a first person plural subjunctive verb, a lot of times it's going to be the hortatory subjunctive, and it's going to be a polite command saying, let us do something. The second example they give here, laudemur, may we be praised. That's expressing a wish, somewhat similar to the hortatory subjunctive, except it's not really telling anyone to do anything. It's just expressing a wish. Sometimes in Latin you'll see it called the optative subjunctive. The third example they give here, laudetur, that's third person singular. Again, the subjunctive can communicate action that's not real, but could be just a possibility. So here it's got the idea of it's possible that he may be praised. So he may be praised, he may not be praised. We don't know, so we can just say it in the subjunctive. Laudetur, he may be praised. And again, these are going to fit into larger, sentences and phrases that will give you more of a context. We're just sort of studying them out of context here. So what else do they say here? They say, no one meaning can be given for subjunctive forms. That's a great way to communicate that because in Latin you have different flavors of subjunctive. You have different ways to use it in various clauses and phrases. So there is no one meaning you can give. You have to look at the context. Going on, it says, in independent clauses or sentences, the present may be translated as in the illustrations just given. In dependent clauses by may, should, would, or as explained in 198 and elsewhere. The words that they just shared here, may, should, or would, that's probably the most common way I hear people describe the subjunctive. They'll say, oh yeah, the subjunctive is the would, could, should way to say things. And that's true. It is would, could, and should. But there's more to it than that. It's got different flavors of meaning that it can be used to communicate. Okay, let's move on now to section 198. And in this particular section, we're going to talk about one of the most common ways that the subjunctive is used in Latin. And that is to make what is called a purpose clause. Okay? So what do we mean when we say that we want to express purpose? Well, the idea is you want to express the purpose for which someone is doing some kind of activity. If I say to my wife, I'm going to the store to get some bread. Okay, the first part of the sentence is I'm going to the store. That just tells her where I'm going. But the second part tells her why I'm going, the purpose behind it, okay? And in English, we can use the word to. We can say, to get some bread. And what that tells the listener is that that's the purpose. It's the same as if we said, for the purpose of getting some bread. I could also say, if I wanted to sound more formal, I could say, I am going to the store so that I might get some bread. So we have several ways to say it in English. We can use the word to. I am going to the store to get some bread. I could say, I am going to the store for the purpose of getting some bread. Or I could say, I am going to the store so that I might get some bread. No matter how you slice it, not the bread, but the Latin grammar, no matter how you slice it, that kind of phrase is called a purpose clause. It's the clause that tells you the purpose of why you're doing something. And so in section 198, that is what we're doing. We're learning how to say that kind of thing in Latin. So we're going to use the subjunctive mood to create a purpose clause. And so all four of these model sentences here are arranged around that concept, the idea of expressing a purpose clause. So let's jump into the actual sentences here, the model sentences, and let's study how to say this in Latin. Okay, number one says, Caesar venit ut milites laudet. Okay, ignore the part in parentheses, veniet, you don't need that. So the main clause here, the main part of the sentence is Caesar venit. That means Caesar is coming or Caesar comes. Venit is present tense, third person singular. And then we have the purpose clause. That's ut milites laudet. Okay, so the word ut can do different things. Sometimes the word ut can just mean as. But in this particular context, ut is how you start off a purpose clause. So here we can translate it as so that, or just that. I personally tend to translate it as so that. I guess that's just the way I was taught. It doesn't really matter. You could translate it as for the purpose that. You can translate it however you want, as long as it communicates the idea that it's setting up a purpose clause. So my recommendation would be simply to translate it as so that. Okay? And then within the purpose clause, we have a verb, laudet. That's a form of the verb laudo, which means praise. Notice that it has an E before the personal ending. So laudet is third person singular, subjunctive, present tense. If it were indicative, it would be laudat with an A, but instead it's laudet. And within the purpose clause, the subject is unstated. So notice that when we do our translation, we'll throw in a pronoun he to represent Caesar. Milites is not the subject of the purpose clause. That's actually the direct object. Milites is accusative plural. So again, ut sets up the purpose clause. Laudet works off of that as a subjunctive verb showing purpose, okay? So the whole thing says, Caesar is coming so that he might praise the soldiers. Now, the English translation that the authors of the book give is a little different than the one that I'm saying. A few moments ago, I mentioned that there are different ways to express a purpose clause in English. You can use the word to. We could say, Caesar is coming to praise the soldiers. And that's how the authors of the book render their English translation. They say, Caesar is coming to praise the soldiers. And then in parentheses, they have an alternate translation, which is more of the way I would do it, that he may praise. Although I tend to put in the word so, I say so that. I think it's just clearer. It just expresses the meaning in a more clear way. Okay, so number one says, Caesar is coming so that he might praise the soldiers. Okay, purpose clause with ut, subjunctive verb in the purpose clause, and it expresses purpose. Okay, let's skip over number two just for a moment. That's a little more complicated. Let's go to actually number 4 and talk about that one, because that's just one step up in complexity. Let's look at number 4. Bellum geremus ne sit rex. So the main part of the sentence is bellum geremus. The verb is geremus. That's a form of the verb gero, which means bear or carry. That's a third conjugation verb. And so with the E there, before the personal ending, that indicates future tense in the third conjugation. So geremus says we will bear or we will carry. And then we have the word bellum, which means war. And so when you have the verb gero and bellum together, it means wage war. So bellum geremus says we will wage war. And then we have a negative purpose clause, which is ne sit rex. And so I'd like to introduce you to this word ne here in E, which can do a couple of different things. It can negate a verb when the verb is in the subjunctive. It can just mean not, like the word non, except you can use it to negate non-indicative verbs. But here, as it's setting up a purpose clause, it's basically like a negative version of ut. Okay, in number 1, we talked about how ut means so that. Okay, so here, the word ne is negating a purpose clause, and so it basically means so that not. Okay, it's just like ut, except negative. So ut means so that, ne means so that not. And then we have the verb sit. Sit is a form of sum est, sumus estis sunt. but it's subjunctive. So the forms in the present tense are sim, sis, sit, simus, situs, sint. Okay, this is third person singular. So it means he, she, or it is, but with a subjunctive flavor to it. So it means something like he, she, or it might be, or he, she, or it would be. Okay, it's subjunctive. So together with ne, and this negative purpose clause, it means something like so that he might not be, or so that she might not be, or so that it might not be. And then we have a predicate nominative, which is the word rex, which means king. Within the purpose clause, the subject is unstated. The word rex is not the subject, that's a predicate nominative. Therefore, when we translate the purpose clause, we have to supply a pronoun to be the subject, okay? So we'll translate sit along with a pronoun. Imagine for a moment between ne and sit, imagine that there's the word ariovistus. Then it would say, ne ariovistus sit rex. Then it would say, so that ariovistus might not be king. Then ariovistus would be the subject, and it would be clear what the subject is. But here we don't have the luxury of that, separate word to be the subject. So we have to just throw in the pronoun he. We have to supply that in our translation. Okay, so number 4 says, we will wage war so that he might not be king. Okay, again, that's a negative purpose clause with ne functioning as a negative form of ut. Let's take a look at number 3, and we will see the word ne in action again, or in inaction, because it's negative. So let's read number 3 in Latin. Milites pugnant ne oppidum expugnatur. Okay, please ignore the word in parentheses, that's pugnabunt. Just don't concern yourself with it for right now. The main clause here is milites pugnant. Okay, pugnant is a form of the verb pugno, which means fight. That's a first conjugation verb. It's third person plural, and the subject along with it is milites, which means soldiers. That's a third declension noun. Okay, milites pugnant. Together, those two words say the soldiers are fighting. Then we have another negative purpose clause, just like in number 4. We have ne oppidum expugnatur. Remember that in number 4, within the purpose clause, we didn't have a separate word to be the subject. We had to throw in a pronoun in our translation. Here, though, we have a separate noun functioning as the subject of the purpose clause, and that's oppidum. So the word oppidum is the subject of the verb expugnatur. And again, ne is functioning as a negative form of ut. It's like ut, but negative. So it starts out the purpose clause saying, so that something might not happen. The verb here is expugnatur. That's a form of the verb expugno, which, by the way, is just pugno with a prepositional prefix attached to it. By itself, the verb pugno means to fight, but with ex as a prefix, expugno, it means something like to storm, like if an army comes in and storms a town, if they take it by storm, that's what expugno means. And so expugno as a verb is first conjugation, just like pugno. A couple more things to notice. It's passive, right? We have tur as the ending. That's a third person singular passive ending. So he, she, or it is being taken by storm, okay? So finally, notice that expugnatur has the letter E as its connector vowel before the personal ending, which is tur. And this particular E is long. Notice the macron. So anyway, taken as a whole, the verb expugnatur says this: he, she, or it is being taken by storm, but we need to express it with a subjunctive flavor, like he, she, or it might be taken by storm, he, she, or it would be taken by storm. That's the kind of thing communicated by the subjunctive. And again, the subject of that verb is Obpogno, which means town. So the entire negative purpose clause says this: so that the town might not be taken by storm, or so that the town might not be stormed, okay? So we have a purpose clause. We have a purpose clause that is being negated. It's a negative one. We have a purpose clause in which there's a stated subject, Obpogno. We have a purpose clause in which the verb is passive with the TUR ending. And as always, the verb in the purpose clause is subjunctive. So number 3, the soldiers are fighting so that the town might not be stormed, or so that the town might not be taken by storm. In some translations, especially older ones, you'll see the word lest here, L-E-S-T. And so the way they would translate it is like this: the soldiers are fighting lest the town be taken by storm. Okay, so if you're ever reading an English translation of some Latin and you see that word lest, that's what it's doing. It's trying to translate the negativeness of a clause like that. I personally prefer just a more simple, plain English translation, something not so archaic. I mean, the word lest is perfectly good English. However, it is a bit archaic, perhaps a bit formal. These days, there are so many translations and so many texts available on the internet, which is great. We have access to so much material. Due to copyright laws, a lot of that material is older, sometimes from even the 19th century, which is fine because they did great scholarship back then. But when you use some of those older materials, you have to look out for archaic language like lest. But besides that, they're great, and we have access to all of them thanks to the magic of the interwebs and thanks to lots of people scanning things. Okay, great. Let's move on to number 2, and let's take a look at a slightly more complicated flavor of purpose clause, okay? The kind of purpose clause that we will see in this particular sentence is called a relative clause of purpose, okay? Now, if you think back 2 lessons to lesson 21, you'll remember that we took quite a long time to meticulously go through relative clauses and how they function in Latin. Relative clauses, relative pronouns, the different ways that relative pronouns can do things in relative clauses. So now, all that stuff we learned about relative clauses is coming back to us now, and we need to remember all that and apply it here as we learn a new way to use relative clauses, okay? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a relative clause in such a way that it expresses purpose. Again, we're going to use a relative clause in a special way that makes it express purpose, like a purpose clause. Okay, so hang in there with me and let's look at number 2. Here's what it says. Caesar mittit legionem quae agros vastet. Okay, so we have our main clause. By the way, forget the word mittet in parentheses. Just ignore it. So Caesar mittit legionem. That's the main clause. What does it say? It says Caesar is sending a legion. Caesar is the subject. Mittit, that's a form of the verb mitto, which means send. It's mitto, mittere, third conjugation. So here with an I before the personal ending, that's present tense. Mittit is he, she, or it is sending. And then we have legionem, that's accusative of the third declension feminine noun legio, which means legion. So Caesar mittit legionem says Caesar is sending a legion. Now we have a relative clause, which is quae agros vastet. Okay, the relative pronoun here is quae. Within the relative clause, that is functioning as the subject. The verb is wastet. That's a form of the verb wasto, which is a first conjugation verb that means to destroy, to lay waste, to devastate. In fact, our English word devastate is just the Latin verb wasto with a de prefix, de wasto. That's how we get our English word devastate. And then agros is the direct object of wastet. Okay, so quae is the relative pronoun that starts the relative clause. The antecedent is legionem. So let's look at the relationship between legionem and quae. Quae is feminine because its antecedent, legionem, is feminine. Quae is singular because its antecedent, legionem, is singular. But quae is nominative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. In the relative clause, quae is the subject of the verb wastet, okay? So the relative clause says, which devastates the fields. But that's not all there is to the story, because look at wastet. Wastet is subjunctive, okay? It's not wastot. If it were wastot with an A, that would just be third person singular, indicative, present tense. But no, we have the letter E there before the personal ending, and so that's subjunctive. Why is it subjunctive? Because it's part of this special thing called a relative clause of purpose. If we were to read this without any knowledge of relative clauses of purpose, here's how the sentence might read. Caesar is sending a legion which would devastate the fields. Or Caesar is sending a legion which might devastate the fields. Okay? So I'm trying to capture that subjunctive flavor of wastet. But when an ancient Roman wrote a sentence like this, what they were trying to express is purpose. And so with this relative clause here, with the subjunctive verb in it, with this kind of setup, what it is expressing is this. Caesar is sending a legion so that it might devastate the fields. So quae here is starting a relative clause that is going to tell us purpose. And that's why in parentheses, after quae, the authors of the book have put an equal sign. And they're saying it's equal to as if someone had said ut ea. What would ut ea say? Ut ea would say, so that it. Okay, ea is feminine, a feminine form of isea id, referring back to legio, which is feminine. So just for a moment, let's pretend like it says ut ea instead of quae. Just, put your pinky finger over the quae and just pretend like it's not there. And instead we have ut ea. Now it says, Caesar is sending a legion so that it, meaning the legion, might devastate the fields. So quae here, with this relative clause of purpose, it's doing the same thing as if it were just a regular purpose clause with ut. One other thing to keep in mind is that when you use this kind of relative clause, you really need to have an antecedent that's already been stated and is clear, okay? So we have the word legionem here. That's the antecedent of quae. If the word legionem were not here, then this really does not work as a relative clause of purpose because you need to have a strongly stated antecedent. In fact, let's look at the top of page 69. There's a section there that says section B. So section B at the top of 69, it says, sentence 2, instead of ut, qui may be used when there is an antecedent. In Latin, you can get away with leaving certain things out. We could probably construct that sentence in number 2. So it says something like, Caesar is sending he who might devastate the fields. You could maybe leave out legionem and let the reader, guess what quae is referring to. So what the authors of the book are saying is that that's not a good way to make this kind of clause. With this kind of relative clause of purpose, you need to have that strongly stated, that obvious antecedent, okay? Okay, I think we've covered that pretty thoroughly. We've seen different ways in which you can construct a purpose clause in Latin or a negative purpose clause. So let's move on now to the vocabulary. Not a whole lot here, just things we've already covered here in section 200. We have ut, which means that, in order that, and as I said before, sometimes it can just mean as. In parentheses, you'll notice uti with a long I. That's just an alternate spelling of ut. It's just the same as ut, just simply an alternate spelling, okay? Ne, as we've already mentioned, is just like ut, except negative. And as you can see, they've put the word lest in parentheses. I already mentioned that in some older translations, you'll see the word lest there. And Obpogno, again, that's the first conjugation verb pugno with yet another prepositional prefix. This time it's ob, okay? So we've seen pugno, that means fight. We've seen pugno with the ex prefix, ex, which means to take by storm, ex pugno. Now we have obpogno, which means to fight against or attack. It's ob plus pugno, but the B in the word ob, due to the way people pronounce words, it's a long story, but this is a linguistics thing. The B gets sort of absorbed into the P sound. This is a linguistic thing called assimilation. So the B in ob gets assimilated into the P sound, and it turns into a P. So we get Obpogno with two P's instead of with a B and a P. Sometimes when you put a prepositional prefix onto a verb, it keeps its original spelling, and the consonant at the end of that prefix does not get assimilated into the next sound. Other times, as we see here in Obpogno, other times it does get assimilated. So it's not something that happens every time, and occasionally you'll see different writers spell it different ways, different verbs. Also, you have, editors who put out these Latin texts. Sometimes they, change spellings, and there's even an entire Latin treatise about this by the Venerable Bede, who was a historian of the English Church. The Venerable Bede wrote a book called De Orthographia, which is the word orthography means spelling. So it basically means on the subject of spelling. And in that treatise, he tells you which verbs ought to have assimilation and which ones ought not have assimilation. And he's very opinionated about it. So kind of interesting. But anyway, to make a long story short, here, the B in ob gets assimilated to the next consonant sound, which is a P. That's why you have the preposition ob changing its spelling. Okay, let's move on now to section 201. That's our translation exercises. Go ahead and turn off the recording. Try the exercises on your own, except for numbers 8 and 9. Don't do those, but do all the others, and then when you're finished, turn the recording back on, and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's take a look at these exercises, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, Mittitur ut sit imperator. Okay, we have a main clause, which consists only of one word, and that's mittitur. And then we have an ut clause, which is ut sit imperator, and that's a purpose clause. So let's look at the main clause first. That's the word mittitur. It's a form of the verb mitto, which means send. That's a third conjugation verb. So we have the letter I as the connector vowel before the personal ending. And the personal ending is passive third person singular. Okay, so the idea with mittitur is he, she, or it is being sent. Okay, he, she, or it is being sent. And then the purpose clause tells us the purpose for which someone is being sent. Okay, so we have the word ut, which in a purpose clause we can translate as so that. And then we have sit imperator. So what are our ingredients here in the purpose clause? Well, we have the word imperator, which means commander-in-chief. And then we have sit, which, as you already know, is the third person singular form of sum. It's just like est, except it's subjunctive. And so one thing I've mentioned a couple of times here is that within a purpose clause, you have to figure out what is the subject and what's the predicate nominative, if there is one. And so to do that, sometimes you just have to kind of feel it out. If there is no stated subject, sometimes you have to supply a pronoun in your translation. For example, in the word mititur, that's all we have for the main clause. There is no explicitly stated subject. So we have to throw in our own pronoun and translate it as he is being sent, she is being sent, or it is being sent. We don't have any context here. We don't really know who it's supposed to be referring to. But nevertheless, we have to throw that pronoun into our translation. Then when you get to ut sit imperator, we have to figure out what that purpose clause is trying to convey. Okay, it's for the purpose of something. For the purpose of what? Okay, so the commander-in-chief is here. We have sit. You know, technically, this purpose clause could say so that the commander-in-chief might be. Technically, it could say that. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, but it could say that. That's what it might say if you treat imperator as the subject of the purpose clause. Instead, what we really see here is that the word imperator is a predicate nominative within the purpose clause. So the subject within this purpose clause is not explicitly stated. Instead, it's referring to whoever you are already talking about in the sentence, whoever mititur is talking about, whoever the context is talking about, okay? So when we translate the word sit, we have to throw in our own pronoun. In the context of Caesar's Gallic Wars, it's probably a he, so we'll say he. We'll throw in that pronoun for mititur, he is being sent, and then we'll throw that he pronoun in again for sit. So number 1 says, he is being sent so that he might be commander-in-chief. Again, the subject is an unstated he, and then the word imperator is a predicate nominative. Moving on to number 2, mittemur ut pacem confirmemus. Okay, here again we have a main clause and then a purpose clause, starting with the word ut. And so mittemur is the entire main clause. Again, it's just one word. So let's break it down. Mittemur is a form of the verb mitto, which means send. It's a third conjugation verb. It's first person plural. You know, we are doing the action, but it's passive. So MUR is the first person plural passive ending. And then the letter I is the connector vowel. That's present tense here in the third conjugation. And so mittemur says something like, we are being sent, or we are sent. And now our purpose clause is ut pacem confirmemus. Okay, ut will translate as so that. And then within the purpose clause, we have pacem as a direct object. That means peace. That's accusative singular. And then confirmemus is a form of the verb confirmo, which means to affirm or strengthen, things like that. I think it can also mean establish. In the glossary, in the back of the book, for confirmo, it says strengthen, make firm, establish, assure, or declare. Probably establish would be the best translation here. Of course, we have English related words like confirm or confirmation. So it can mean, you know, strengthen, affirm, or in this case, more like establish. Okay, so Confirmemos means we establish, but it's subjunctive. Okay, notice the letter E there. Confirmo is first conjugation. So with the letter E, you get a subjunctive form. So confirmemos means something like we might establish, we should establish, we may establish. Okay, so number 2 altogether says we are being sent so that we might establish peace. Number 3 is next. Consules non mittuntur ut obsides dent. Okay, we have a main clause and then a purpose clause. The main clause is consules non mittuntur, and the purpose clause is ut obsides dent. Okay, so consules means consuls, right? In ancient Rome, they had 2 heads of state each year, sort of like a president, but instead of one of them, they had 2 of them each year who shared the duties. And so each year you'd have 2 consuls, and the role of the consuls was not strictly political like our president is today in the United States. In the United States, we have a strict, dividing line between military government officials and civilian government officials. In ancient Rome, however, political leaders could just suddenly go out and lead an army. So there wasn't that separation between political, or civilian and military. So a consul could just take an army and go out and just start fighting a war. But then they could come back and just be like the president again. So kind of different from how our president functions here in the good old US of A. So in this particular sentence, we have the consuls non mittuntur, okay? And mittuntur means they are being sent. Okay, it's present tense. It's a form of the verb mitto. That's third conjugation. Here it's third person plural passive. So consules non mittuntur says the consuls are not being sent. Now we have a purpose clause, ut obsides dent. Okay, the word obsides means hostages. In the ancient world, sometimes when 2 nations or 2 people groups would make a pact or a treaty, they would exchange hostages. The idea was that if either side went back on the deal, they would have these hostages there who could be somehow punished. And so the idea with hostages was that it was a way to prevent each party from backing out or going back on the deal later. And so in Caesar's Gallic Wars, you see this a lot. You see when the different Gallic tribes make some kind of pact with Julius Caesar, they give him some hostages to go along with the deal as a kind of a collateral or some kind of safeguard or some kind of guarantee. Within the relative clause, the word obsides is the direct object. That's accusative plural. So the nominative singular form of this noun is obses, O-B-S-E-S, obses, and the genitive singular is obsidis. So if you take away the is ending from the genitive singular, you get O-B-S-I-D, and so that's the genitive stem of that word for hostage. Okay, so it's obses, obsidis. So you take the genitive stem, you add es for the accusative plural ending, and you get obsides, okay? The word dent is the verb within the purpose clause. That's a form of the verb do, which means give. Do is first conjugation, slightly irregular, but generally regular. Do, dare, dedi, datum are the 4 principal parts. And so dent would be third person plural, present tense, subjunctive. So dent on its own could mean they might give, they would give, they should give. So number 3 as a whole says this: the consuls are not being sent so that they might give hostages. Okay, again, you have ut starting the purpose clause. Dent is the subjunctive verb within the purpose clause. That's how it links together. Number 4 is next. This first word is quite a mouthful. Conscribimini ut in provincia pugnatis. Okay, we have a main clause and a purpose clause. Again, the main clause consists of just one word, and that's conscribimini. This is the verb conscribo, which we've talked about before. It means to draft people, to make conscripts of people, to compel them into some kind of military force. It's not a voluntary thing. The person who's being brought into the military force doesn't have a choice in the matter. Conscribo is third conjugation, and this particular form is second person plural passive. Okay, I don't think we've even seen this before, really. We've seen it in charts, but here it is being used in an actual sentence. So second person plural, that means y'all. Okay, it's when you're talking to more than one person. I grew up in the South, so for me, second person plural is y'all. If you're from the Pittsburgh area, it might be yins. If you're from the Northeast, like New England, it might be yous guys. I don't know, but I say y'all. So conscribimini means y'all are being drafted. Or to use more of a, smooth sounding term, we could say y'all are being enlisted. And that's the main clause. There's a lot packed into that one verb. The purpose clause here is ut in provincia pugnatis. Okay, ut is starting off the purpose clause. We'll translate it as so that. And then we have a subjunctive verb in the purpose clause, pugnatis. That's second person plural, just like conscribimini, except it's active. Okay, so pugnatis means y'all fight. It's a form of the verb pugno, but it's not just y'all fight, it's subjunctive too. Notice the letter E is the connector vowel before the personal ending. So pugnatis says something like y'all would fight, y'all should fight, y'all could fight. Okay, it's subjunctive. And then in provincia means in the province. That's the southern part of France today, the area known as Provence. Okay, so number 4 altogether says, y'all are being enlisted so that y'all might fight in the province. Number 5 is next. Romani in Helvetiam venient, ut eam partem Galliae pacient. Again, we have a main clause and then a purpose clause. The main clause is Romani in Helvetiam venient. The purpose clause is ut eam partem Galliae pacient. So let's look at the main clause first. We have the Romans as the subject, and then venient is the verb. Venient is a form of the verb venio, which means come. This is future tense, third person plural, so it means they will come. Okay, so Romani and venient together says the Romans will come. And then we have the prepositional phrase in Helvetiam. Okay, that means into Helvetia. By the way, Helvetia means what would today be Switzerland. Remember that the preposition in, when it takes the accusative case, it can mean into or against. So here we have it with the accusative, and so in Helvetiam means into Helvetia. So the main clause says, the Romans will come into Helvetia. Now the purpose clause will tell us for what purpose they will do that. Okay, so ut starts off the purpose clause. We'll translate it as so that. There is no explicitly stated subject within the purpose clause. We just have to keep in mind that it's the Romans. Okay, so pacient is the verb. That means, pacient is a form of the verb paco, which means to subdue. It's related to the word pax, P-A-X, which means peace. In the Roman mind, when you subdue a new place, you bring it into a place of peace. You bring it to peace by conquering it. They were very imperialist. So to bring a place to peace in the Roman mind means to conquer it. So we'll translate it as subdue. And notice that it's third person plural subjunctive because it's part of this purpose clause, right? You have to have a subjunctive verb in the purpose clause. So what we have so far says, the Romans will come into Helvetia so that they might subdue. Okay, and then the direct object here is partem. Partem means part, and it's got a form of isea id along with it. Remember the demonstrative isea id. I mentioned a few times that in Latin, demonstratives can function as demonstrative pronouns or demonstrative adjectives, just like in English. Here we have eam functioning as a demonstrative adjective. That's a feminine accusative singular form of isea id. We could translate it as that and say that part. And then Gallii is genitive singular. That's possessing the partem. Okay, so it's that part of Gaul. That's why Gallii is genitive. So put it all together, it says, the Romans will come into Helvetia so that they might subdue that part of Gaul. Number 6 is next. Imperator milites convocat, ut nova signa eis det. As usual, we have a main clause and then a purpose clause. The main clause is Imperator milites convocat. So Imperator is the commander-in-chief. Milites, that means soldiers, that's the direct object. And then convocat is the verb of the main clause. That means to call together, okay? Convocat is simply the verb voco, which means call, with the prepositional prefix con, which means together. It can also work in other ways, but con here in this case means together. So convoco literally means to call together. And so the main clause says the commander-in-chief is calling together the soldiers. Now we have a purpose clause telling us why he's doing that, for what purpose. And so we have this purpose clause here, which is ut nova signa eis det. There is no explicitly stated subject within the purpose clause, so we keep in mind that it's referring to the imperator. Okay, the verb here is det. That's a form of the verb do. Do is first conjugation, do, das, dat, damus, datus, dant. And so here, it's third person singular. Notice that it's subjunctive. It's got the letter E there. Instead of dot, which would be indicative, it's det, which is subjunctive. So what we have so far would say the commander-in-chief is calling together the soldiers so that he might give. And then the word signa, that's the direct object within the purpose clause. That means signals, or it can also mean things that they would carry into battle that would show what part of the army they're part of. So a signum could be, it could be like a thing on a pole that would stick up into the air, and it would have different ornaments on it. And I think it would actually say what part of the legion you're in. You know, a legion was a large army unit, something like a brigade today in the modern United States Army. And so it would be divided into lots of smaller parts. In today's Army, we have a brigade, and then that's divided into battalions. Battalions are divided into companies. Companies are divided into platoons. Platoons are divided into squads. Squads are divided into teams. Teams are divided into individual troops, individual soldiers. So you have lots of divisions of the military today. Of course, in the Navy and the Air Force, they call them different things, but you get the idea. And they had all those same kinds of divisions in the ancient Roman army. They had cohorts, and they had groups of 100, which might correspond to a platoon today. And so depending on what part of the legion you're in, your part of the legion might have an ornamental pole that you carry that identifies your part of the legion. And in some English translations, you'll see that translated as a standard. And in some illustrations, you'll see different discs on it, maybe an animal skin, or maybe the person carrying it might have an animal skin. It's hard to know what they looked like exactly, but suffice it to say that it was a standard kind of thing, not a flag really, but more of an ornamental pole with stuff. And actually, there's a picture in the book. If you turn to page 32, you'll see a picture of a signum. That particular one seems to be, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on this, but that seems to be the signum for the entire legion because it has the eagle on the top. And so if you were in the legion and it was your job to carry the standard or your job to carry the eagle, that was kind of a big deal because you weren't supposed to lose it. If you lose the eagle, that's really humiliating for the ancient Roman army. So my point here is that in exercise number 6, we have someone giving the troops a new signum, a new ornamental standard that they can carry that identifies them. Okay, so that's what's happening here in this exercise, okay? And then finally, eis, that's a form of id. That's dative plural, and it means to them, okay? Remember that the dative case shows indirect object. It shows the recipient or beneficiary in the sentence, okay? That's what an indirect object is, the party that's receiving or benefiting. So number 6 as a whole says this: the commander-in-chief is calling together the soldiers so that he might give new standards to them. Number 7 is next. Prauraki sua opida incendunt, ne ab hostibus oppugnentur. Okay, we have a main clause, and then we have a purpose clause, which happens to be a negative purpose clause. So let's look at the main clause first. That's Prauraki sua opida incendunt. Okay, the Prauraki are a Gallic tribe, that's nominative plural, and the verb here is incendunt. That's a form of the verb incendo, which means to set something on fire. So this is third person plural, present tense. So the idea here is that the Prauraki are setting on fire. And what are they setting on fire? The direct object is sua opida. Okay, opida means towns. That's accusative plural. It's neuter, so that's why you have the accusative plural ending as the letter A. And sua is that adjective that means his, her, or its, or their, and it refers back to the subject. Okay, so sometimes they put the word own in parentheses when they translate it. So the first part of the sentence, the main clause, says the Prauraki are setting on fire their own towns. Okay, so sua tells us that the towns belong to the Prauraki. If it said Prauraki opida eius incendunt, that would mean that they're setting on fire the towns of somebody else, of someone other than the Prauraki. But with sua here, it means it's their towns. So the Prauraki are setting on fire their own towns. And now this negative purpose clause is going to tell us the purpose for that, or rather the thing they don't want to have happen. So we have the word ne here, and that's going to start out this negative purpose clause with the idea of so that not, so that something will not happen, okay? Within the purpose clause, we have the verb oppugnentur. That's a form of the verb obpogno. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson. It means to fight against or attack. And this is first conjugation, third person plural, and it's passive. Okay, so the idea is they are being attacked. Okay, but it's also subjunctive. So the idea is They would be being attacked. They might be being attacked. They should be being attacked. There's that unrealness involved with the subjunctive. So what we have so far says, the Rauraki are setting fire to their own towns so that they might not be attacked. Okay? There's no explicitly stated subject within the purpose clause. So we have to think of the subject as being the same thing that was the subject of the main clause. Finally, we have an ablative of agent. Okay? Whenever you have a passive verb in Latin, you can have something in the ablative case that shows you by whom that action is being done. In English, we use the word by to state that. If I say, my lawn was mowed, that's a passive statement. I'm saying the yard or the lawn passively was mowed. And then I can use the word by to say who it was mowed by or by whom it was mowed. So if I say, my lawn was mowed by Bob, then I'm using the word by there to show that that passive activity was done by Bob. Same thing in Latin. You can use ob, which is a preposition that takes the ablative. It comes in two forms, a or ob. So you can use a or ob plus the ablative to show by whom a passive activity was done. Okay, and so when you do that, that's called an ablative of agent because the agent is the person who did the activity. So ob hostibus says by the enemies. Hostibus is ablative plural. That's a form of the noun hostis, which means enemy. That's third declension. In an English translation, we generally don't say by the enemies. In a military context, you make sort of a collective noun out of it, and you just say the enemy. It's sort of a general kind of noun. So instead of by the enemies, we'll say by the enemy. So number 7 altogether says, the Rauraki are setting fire to their own towns so that they, referring to the towns, might not be attacked by the enemy. Literally by the enemies, but we translate it into good English as by the enemy. Let's skip over 8 and 9 and go straight to number 10. It says, eidem civitates Germanos virtute praecedent. There's no purpose clause here. It's just a regular sentence. The subject here is civitates, which means states, and the main verb is praecedent. So that's the skeleton of the sentence. Germanos is the direct object. So civitates means states, and praecedent is the verb. Praecedo is a third conjugation verb, and it's a compound verb. It's really just the verb cedo, C-E-D-O, which can mean various things like go or move. It can also mean yield. And it's got a prefix attached to the front, which is P-R-A-E, pry. That's where we get our English prefix, pre. The prefix pry comes to us without the letter A in it. The A goes away and you just get P-R-E. So that's why we have pre, meaning before. If you preheat your oven, you heat it up before you cook something. If you pre-soak your dishes, you soak them before you wash them, things like that. So pry means, in Latin, before, in front of, things like that. So praecedo means to go in front of, that's the literal meaning, but the extended or figurative meaning of it is to surpass. Okay, if I'm running a race against someone and I start to go in front of them, I have surpassed them. The idea here is that praecedent means to surpass in the sense of to go in front of someone. And it's future tense, third person plural, The letter E there tells us that it's future for a third conjugation verb. So civitates and praecedent together, they say the states will surpass. And who will they surpass? The Germanos, the Germans. So the states will surpass the Germans. And then we have a couple of words left. We have eidem and virtute. Eidem is a form of idem, which means the same, and it's agreeing with civitates. Notice that it's feminine, nominative plural. So eidem civitates says the same states. And then virtute, that's an ablative singular form of the third declension noun virtus. Okay, if you know the Latin word vir, vir, vir means man, right? So virtus means literally something like manliness, but it also has the meaning of valor, that is, bravery in battle, okay? So virtus means manliness, bravery, valor, things like that. The genitive singular form of virtus is virtutis, okay? So if you take the I and the S away from virtutis, you get virtut. And so that's the genitive stem of this third declension noun. So if you make it ablative singular, you get virtute, okay, with the letter E on the end. So virtute is the ablative singular form of virtus, which, by the way, it's kind of a funny thing, but this word for manliness is actually grammatically feminine. It's a feminine noun, which I find amusing. It just goes to show that natural gender and grammatical gender are not necessarily related. It's just the different genderings of the declensions really are just morphological classes, not so much related to biological gender. They are to some degree related to biological gender, but they really just become morphological classifications for noun forms. Okay, so virtute is ablative singular, and this is what we call ablative of respect. Okay, so we say it's with respect to valor. So number 10 as a whole says the same states will surpass the Germans with respect to valor. Or we could simplify and just say in valor. We could say the same states will surpass the Germans in valor. Okay, that's it for lesson 23. As always, be sure to experience the Latin language in all four ways that you can: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. That will give you a much more rich language experience, and it will help you to learn the Latin language better and faster. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time in lesson 24.